It's my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Abe Edwards, who's a teaching professor at Michigan State's Lyman Briggs College. Dr. Edwards transforms students who are apt to describe their mathematical background as painful into productive and engaged students who describe having enjoyed their experiences in his classes. A mark of his success is the number of students that continue on to have success in higher level courses. One thing that stood out to me was, one person said that one thing that stood out to them was his summer abroad course that he teaches on mathematical, historical, and cultural contexts, with visits to Paris, Florence, and London. I know I want to take this class. The course takes place in museums, cathedrals, libraries, and cafes, utilizing his collaboration with colleagues at European universities to give students behind-the-scenes access to remarkable sites and artifacts associated with the history of mathematics. Beyond the classroom, Dr. Edwards demonstrates his commitment to mathematics education through mentorship of undergraduate learning assistants at LBC, contributions to triumphs, leading a popular 2022 MathFest workshop, learning from history, teaching with primary resource projects in your mathematics classroom, and other presentations on mathematics teaching at local, national, and international conferences. Please help me in joining to welcome Dr. Abe Edwards.
Thank you. I am tempted to do something that we sometimes do in church, which is to ask everyone to just move toward the front, since the room is, but we're just going to let you be comfortable today. I will say before I start, if you are interested in being part of that study abroad program in the history of mathematics, I'm always looking for collaborators. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. I do want to thank the committee. I want to thank the association for this teaching award. Teaching awards, even though they're given to individuals, are rarely the result of one individual effort. And there are many, many people who their fingerprints are on this award, so to speak. I will try to keep my remarks brief, but I want to say a few things about nurturing mathematical discourse by teaching with primary sources. And I think nurturing is the word that I want here in terms of the activity that I try to engage my students with in the classroom. I suppose that there are some of you out there who, your classrooms on day one of the fall semester, the students are already buzzing with excitement about the intermediate value theorem. But for me, it's more like nurturing the tomato plants in my garden and giving them everything that I've got in order to see them bear fruit. So I'm just going to talk about one thing that I do in the classroom to help nurture student discourse. Whoops, maybe we will, let's do this. There we go. My ideas about this were sparked by a quote from the British novelist and chemist C.P. Snow, who saw an increasing gulf during the middle of the 20th century between people in different academic disciplines. Snow said that he was able to observe two polar groups. At one pole, there were the literary intellectuals. At the other, the scientists. And between the two was a gulf of mutual incomprehension. Snow recounted moments in his career when his colleagues in the humanities would look down on those of us in the sciences because we were unfamiliar with things like, and this was the example he gave, the sonnets of Shakespeare. On the other hand, those same people in the humanities were often themselves unfamiliar with even basic ideas in the sciences, such as Newton's 3 laws. Snow was not the only one to notice this gulf. The British educator Charlotte Mason, several decades earlier, wrote, "There is a region of apparent sterility in our intellectual life. Science says of literature, 'I'll have none of that,' and science is the preoccupation of our age. When we present theorems divested to the bones of all superfluous trappings, we lose the vitality along with what we have stripped away. History expires in the process, Poetry cannot come to birth. Religion faints. We sit down to the dry bones of science and say, here is knowledge, all the knowledge there is to know. Whether or not Snow and Mason were accurately depicting intellectual life in the first half of the 20th century, these kinds of ideas got me thinking about questions like this. How can we as mathematicians share the vitality and effervescence of mathematics? How can we give theorems back their humanity? I want my students, as Polya said, to experience the tension and enjoy the triumph of mathematical discovery. Well, who are my students? I teach in a residential college for the sciences within Michigan State University. 80% of incoming freshmen to this college intend to become physicians. That's not physicists, that's physicians. 80% of them are intending to go to medical school. I have a small handful of math majors. Many of my students take what I would call a consumerist approach to education. And by that I mean that they see the main value of my class is that it moves them one step closer to getting into medical school. They would see mathematics, if they think about it at all, as a servant to the sciences. It's useful in solving problems in scientific contexts. And here I am thinking about mathematical philosophy and giving theorems back their humanity. I was thinking about Snow and this idea of bridging the two cultures, and so I began to talk to my colleagues in the humanities about what they are doing in their classes. And one thing came to light. There is a practice that is shared by all of my colleagues in the humanities. In their courses, students read and discuss primary source materials. Primary sources, as one historian told me, are like windows into the past. Or another one told me, they're the closest thing we have to time travel today. They present a human story with all of its flaws, and I saw this could be an opportunity for bridging. Maybe I could begin to work some primary source material into my mathematics classes. So the question is, what is a primary source? How could I do this? What's a primary source in mathematics? Well, here's one. This is Euler from 1755. I cannot give this to my students. It's not just that the mathematical notation is archaic. We could presumably overcome that. In fact, it might teach us something. But it's written in Latin. So this is not something that I can do. So here's some things I discovered early in my career when I was trying to teach with primary sources. Things that I have discovered. It is for these things, I think, that I have been given this teaching award. Number 1, avoid Latin. Number 2, even a translation is not enough. I took some translations of Euler and passed them out to my Calc 1 class and said, let's work through this together. And it was a disaster. There was no bridging. There was no effervescent quality to those courses. So one solution that I came across actually at MathFest a number of years ago is teaching through primary source projects. Primary source projects include some features. They have excerpts from a translated primary source. They have some secondary text written by the project author, which expands and explains the ideas in the source. And then there is a series of student tasks, which are aimed at teaching the mathematical content. The NSF-funded Triumphs project, which you can use this link or just Google Triumphs PSP, will bring you to a collection of over 100 of these primary source projects for all levels throughout the undergraduate mathematical curriculum. I'll just share some examples of these things. But as I say this, it's important to know that when I'm teaching with primary source projects, these are meant to be replacements to my standard treatment. They're not additions to my syllabus. Again, I don't know about you, but most of my syllabi already have too much stuff in them. So these are not meant to add to that load. Each of the projects is designed to help students reach a level of fluency with an idea that is at least as strong as if I had just taught out of the Stewart calculus textbook in roughly the same amount of time. I made up a little list of all the things that I have seen my students engaged in while working on these projects. Conjecturing, testing, refining, generalizing, proving, reflecting, developing mathematical judgment, finding their own mathematical voice. Here's an example from Fermat's method of finding maxima and minima. This is from Calc 1. If you ask my Calc 1 students, how do you find the maximum of a function? What do? You take the derivative and you set it equal to 0 to find your critical points. You test it, etc. So we're talking about the extreme value theorem, finding the extrema of functions, and practice with their derivative rules. However, because the students are working through a primary source on this topic, certain other themes emerge while they are engaged with the project. One of them is to show students how a technique has evolved over time. One is to sort of break them out of this recipe-type thinking with regards to optimization. Another is to get them thinking about questions like, now what counts as a general method? Is this going to work for all functions? Is this only going to work for the examples that Fermat has picked? This is an example of what the source text looks like. This is from Fermat. It says, let us offer an example. Let AC be a line divided at E so that the rectangle AE by EC is a maximum. Straightforward. The method that Fermat gives for finding the maximum is not the same as the one in a modern textbook, although there are similarities. And like many projects, the students work through a historical method. They work through a modern method. They compare the two. They compare and contrast these. Student tasks ask them to think about notation, to apply a modern method. Does it confirm the results that Fermat gives? To think about comparing their work with Fermat's, thinking about symbols in both the modern and historical formats. In the Fermat project, they get to see examples of things that I had not considered in terms of optimization. In the working of a great number of problems, Fermat writes, asymmetries will present themselves. Let there be a semicircle whose diameter is AB. Let DC be perpendicular to it. Find the maximum of the sum of the lines AC and CD. This is a great little problem. But in addition to the mathematics, teaching with primary sources reveals to students something of the human character of the people who develop these ideas. For example, when Fermat was communicating his ideas about finding the maximum of functions, he was very pleased with himself. He writes, "We can hardly be provided with a more general method." But not everyone was convinced. And in fact, at this point in the project, after seeing a couple of examples, my students are not convinced it's a general method either. And I say, well, if you're not convinced, you are in good company, because there was a contemporary mathematician named Descartes who also expressed some doubts about Fermat's work. Descartes wrote to a mutual friend, Marin Mersenne, in 1638 and said, if he, meaning Fermat, if Fermat speaks of wanting to send you still more papers, I beg you to ask him to think them out more carefully than those preceding. But by the end of their correspondence, Descartes has come around to seeing that Fermat's method is legitimate. Seeing the last method that you use for finding tangents to curved lines, I can reply to it in no other way than to say, it is very good, and that if you had explained it in this manner at the outset, I would not have contradicted you at all. Which I think is a ringing endorsement, not just for students, but also for myself, to show my work and explain my reasoning carefully. One of the things I love about teaching with primary source projects is that they give students exposure to mathematics as it was developed in cultures around the world. One of my favorite projects is a genetic context for understanding the trigonometric functions, which I implement in my pre-calculus class. In this history of trigonometry and how we develop the 6 trigonometric functions that I teach in pre-calculus, students are able to read selections from Greek mathematicians such as Hipparchus and Ptolemy. They read mathematics from India and also from the Islamic Golden Age. One of the sources is the exhaustive treatise on shadows, which was written in the court of a Turkish sultan in the year 1021, which was exactly 1,000 years before Danny Otero wrote the primary source project, which used this source. I thought that was amazing. Or another one. I use this in Calc 2 when we talk about series approximations for sine. Bhaskara's approximation to and Madhava's series for sine. I'll never forget the day in my Calc 2 class when I implemented this project for the first time, and 6 of my students who grew up in India got to this page and all burst out in surprise at the same time at seeing Sanskrit, something that they had learned as children growing up in school. It was a transformational moment for the entire semester. Of course, you don't need to understand Sanskrit to do the project. The author kindly gives you an English translation. There are some challenges to teaching with primary source projects. Many of my students struggle with reading. It's a heavy lift to ask them to read historical writing, even if it has been translated. The time required for me to prep the lessons is greater than if I just walk in and lecture. The projects are not always well aligned with my online homework system. However, because these are intended to be replacements to a standard treatment, I can just replace the online homework for that component as well. One of the challenges which I'm not sure how to overcome yet is to avoid interpreting history through the prejudices of today, which Jacqueline Steedall talks about. In other words, I don't want to communicate something to my students along the lines of, all of history was an inevitable series of events which culminated in you. If only people had been as smart as you back in the day. So we try to avoid this type of history. And then I suffer this criticism from certain others. I'm sure none of them are in this room, but people have said things to me such as, if you spend all this time on the historical approach, they, meaning the students, won't learn as much. To which I would respond with, what does it mean to learn? I'm just going to give you one phrase from the mathematics education literature, comognition. Comognition was a term coined by Anna Svard, which is a blend of the ideas of cognition and communication. The idea of cognitive theory is that learning is conceptualized as communication with oneself and with others. In other words, learning and communication are nearly synonymous. You could think about it this way. As a student increases the sophistication of their mathematical discourse, the way they talk about mathematical ideas, the examples they use, the nuances that they put into it, the ideas they're willing to share with others, the questions that they ask, as that communication becomes more sophisticated, what they are doing is actually increasing their participation in the mathematical community. The student is at the edge of the community. They are slowly being brought into the center. Primary source projects give students opportunities to witness mathematicians at work, and, as Svard said, to imitate his moves while trying to figure out the reasons for the strange things that we are doing. I think this could be the first essential step in helping students tell new stories about the world of mathematics and their place in that world. I'll just close with two quotes. And you're going to say, he cherry-picked these quotes from his course evaluations, but that is not true. I get these kinds of comments from students all the time. I had read primary sources in history, but this was the first time in a math class. Struggling with the mathematician's original words gave me better ways to talk about what mathematics is and what it is for. And then Briella, names have been changed to protect the guilty. Briella was a student that I had in college algebra as a freshman. She later took Calculus 1 with me. If you teach at a place where there's small class sizes, you end up with some of these students that are essentially groupies. So I had her for college algebra, Calc 1, Calc 3, and she wrote at the end of Calc 1, "I've never been good at math. I knew this in junior high. I always believed I'm just not a math person, and so I stopped contributing in class. What I discovered in this course is that I was wrong." Sorry. I loved reading the primary sources and working on them with others. For the first time since like 5th grade, I realized I had something to contribute to the discussion. Briella is now pursuing her PhD at Wayne State. I think she's doing fine. Thank you again for this award and for your patience with me. Yeah, the question was if you were going to implement projects like this, for example, in Calc 1 this fall, are there things you have to sacrifice in order to make time for them? Or I don't believe that I'm subtracting anything by bringing these in. I'm going to teach optimization anyway. I'm going to teach Fermat's theorem for finding critical points, and so it's really just a swap for me. I'm not going to teach every topic through primary source projects. For me in Calc 1, if I can do 2 or 3 of these in the semester, I think that's fine. I have colleagues who will teach a whole course using these projects, but yeah, I just haven't got there yet myself. So there are things that I've cut out of my Calc 1 curriculum, but not because I've added primary source projects, just because I thought they were silly. The question was, how big are my courses? Sure, 40 to 50. So I think I have 48 enrolled in Calc 1 in the fall.
When deciding on primary source projects, what features do you look for a particular class? Is it the historical element? Is it the mathematical element? Is it interest to students? Is it just availability? Is it a good translation? What are some features that you kind of rank, or you just look at something you feel like this works?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, I would publish some paper on this. I think it's a mix of all the things that you said. I want projects that are going to be engaging for the students, and in particular, I try to look for opportunities within a project where different kinds of students can get engaged. It's not always my strongest math students who are the greatest contributor to these projects. Often the students who maybe consider themselves weaker in mathematics are the ones who get most engaged by these. So I look for projects that have lots of on-ramps for different kinds of students. I also just look for projects that I personally find interesting, because I think when we enjoy something, we are able to pass on that enthusiasm as well. Thank you.